How you guys doing?
Great,
Not too
man.
bad. Good start to the month.
Yeah, October.
October indeed.
Yeah, some of the pullbacks we got in September was pretty big, mainly for Solana.
Do you think Solana might hit all-time highs now?
I think it will, but who knows, right? I think it will at least test like $300. My target would probably be around like $400 to $500 this cycle if we get like really nice pumps on the alts. I think we can just start, and if people join later, they could catch up later. So the plan is to kind of like run over some pool scanning and maybe a few things that have not been added to the course yet, just because sometimes like these platforms change a lot, and hopefully it helps you guys out. But a lot of it is included in the course, at least like the concepts behind it, right? Feel free to interrupt at any time. And what I'm going to run through in this workshop is using Revert Finance first, and then stuff like Crystal, and then maybe Coin Market Cap to look for different pools, and then also Metrics Finance. But Metrics Finance is paid. I know that some of you guys probably don't have the pro subscription. It's a nice tool, really good tool, but it's not really like 100% necessary, right? So let's dive into the Revert first. And again, you guys can ask questions in the chat as well. But basically, if we're looking for like a token first approach, which is what I typically like to do if we are focusing on blue chip assets, which is what this workshop is going to be focused on. A lot of times what we're going to see is like, if we do the token first approach, we're going to be looking into the token first after we've heard about it, or, just looking at like some different alpha on X or on YouTube, right? Let's say you just learn about Solana, you could look into Solana. Or if you just learn about like Chainlink, you could look for like different opportunities for yield farming Chainlink, right? And a really useful tool for this is this Revert Discover tab. And when I filmed the course, they didn't have this yet. So they had it in the top positions. And you can use that to filter for specific NFT positions as well that have been yield farming for a while. But if you want to look at the pools directly, then we want to be looking at this Discover tab, right? What I want to do in this case is just go to this token tab, and then I could filter it by, let's say, wrapped ETH. And then I could do link if I want to look for link pools. And then you can see a bunch of different pools would pop up, right? And then you can see the fees APR. But the most important metric is just fees to total value locked, because it kind of normalizes the different features, right? Some platforms use stuff like volume to total value lock, but that's not as useful of a metric, simply because you kind of need to like normalize, standardize the fees to be able to get like a more accurate APR comparison. And what's really nice is you could set this to like 1 month as well to make sure that the data is relatively recent, but not so recent that it's only like 1 day old, right? And then again, you could be filtering by fees to total value locked. And let's see what it pops up. So right off the bat, you can see some of the pools have lower total value locked. And this is completely fine, especially if you guys are not working with like millions of dollars to be depositing into these pools. Let's say you just want to put in 10K. It's not going to impact the fees that much. But if you are swapping with like a few $100,000 at a time, then you definitely don't want to go for these lower total value lock pools, right? For altcoins and for most people, it's fine to go after it, especially because it often is less crowded than like these higher total value locked runs. For example, on mainnet, you can see even on this lower fee tier here as 220K, but the fee they generate is roughly the same as this 125K TV out pool, right? And the APR could be actually higher or lower depending on the liquidity distribution and the volume consistency. So I could expand it here, but what I like to do is click on this view full stats, and then it's going to pull the data. And then let me do that for this pool as well on Ethereum mainnet. So this is linked to ETH. If we kind of zoom out and just look at it, it does look like it's tighter in terms of liquidity distribution, but it could be okay to have like a distribution like this if the pair is very volatile, because these tighter range are going to get knocked out of range all the time, right? When that happens, you're going to be earning more fees. And again, I personally prefer wider ranges simply because it's lower risk. And then when the pair is volatile, you're going to be earning more fees when these tight ranges get knocked out of range anyway. But if we look at the mainnet pool, it is a little bit more distributed. And this is typically the case simply because it costs more gas fees to rebalance on mainnet, right? And a lot of tight range strategies would not be running on mainnet, especially with like lower amounts of liquidity, simply because the gas fees would be just too much. And then what we want to do here is filter by age. And what I really like to compare as well is the full range APR, simply because then you don't have to worry about like the specific range you're setting, right? Some ranges, for example, are really tight, and then you're going to get a higher APR, but maybe you're out of range all the time. So the net profit could be lower as well. We don't really know until like, it's been yield farming for quite a while, right? But you can see for this specific pool on mainnet, you're going to be able to pull roughly 9.7% APR, which is quite solid for a full range LP. And then I can compare that with the pool on Polygon. Sometimes there will not be a full range LP. You can see this is somewhat of a wider range, but even here, you can see that the fees is less than the other pool that we were just looking at, right? So I could click into the NFT ID as well on Polygon. But the main idea is usually the higher the peak of a liquidity pool, the worse it is for the APR. So even though on like the surface level, it seems like this top pool would generate more APR for you, right? It's just, the reason why is because the concentrate liquidity, you could think of it as like there's more liquidity available. So when there's like larger swaps, it's able to absorb more volume. That's why this metric would be higher. It's pulling more fees, but a lot of those fees are going to the tight range LPs and not to the wider range one, right? So we can look here. This position has been relatively recent, 40 something days. And again, the fee APR has been lower than like this other pool on mainnet has also been around for roughly 40 something days, right? So that's something to consider. Again, the flatter, the better. And what we could also look at directly on Revert as well is the volume consistency. You can see 30 days volume looks pretty consistent, and you can zoom out to 180 days. And let's do that for this other pool as well. So you're going to be able to see sometimes the volume dries up. It could be a couple different things. It could be that people are withdrawing their liquidity and there's very little liquidity. That's why the volume dropped. When there's low liquidity, typically the volume would be lower. And then if a ton of people add liquidity, your APR would drop, but then the volume would come up as well, simply because when people are making large swaps, the swaps would run through like the higher liquidity pools more, right? And it's going to pick up the volume as well. So you can see the volume in the last 30 to 60 days have been relatively constant. We could look at the total value locked as well. There's no like crazy spike in total value locked. And you can see that I mentioned that if there's very low liquidity, the volume would die down, right? Which is exactly what is happening in this pool here. And what's really nice about Revert is you could turn on this volume to TVL, which kind of like normalizes the volume and the total value locked so that it shows you the data without the effects of like, okay, like this guy is adding liquidity and removing liquidity and stuff like that, right? But you can see the consistency has been really solid. So if you're bullish on Chainlink and Ethereum, then this amount of APR is quite sustainable. And that's roughly what you could expect. And depending on what you want to do, you could also back test this position, right? You could create position. And then if I pull up the chart really quickly for Link and ETH, let's put say 1 ETH. So Chainlink, and then I could set the quote asset to be Ethereum, right? And I typically like to use the larger token as a core asset simply because a lot of times I'm trying to accumulate the larger cap token like Ethereum in these types of pools, right? I want to enter when Chainlink is relatively cheap compared to Ethereum by swapping some Ethereum for Chainlink, pairing it into this pool. And then when Chainlink outperforms Ethereum, I could close this pool for a nice Ethereum profit, even without the fees, right? So that's like the asset appreciation. Whatever Chainlink you bought at this current price, for example, as the price trend up, you're going to be able to sell it for more Ethereum on the way up at a better exchange rate than your entry, right? So that's the idea. And my main strategy behind like altcoin pairs is I want to try to get in at a good entry and then ride that appreciation upwards, right? But what I can see here is that a pair is sometimes like have very low volatility, but sometimes the volatility is quite high, right? And this is true for like most altcoins. And what I typically like to do is to look at the weekly chart rather than like the daily chart. It is going to make your APR much more sustainable if you're setting your ranges from either the monthly or the weekly chart, simply because you're zooming out. And then if you're setting your ranges, you're more likely going to be setting wider ranges, right? So if I'm trying to prioritize APR for this case, I typically would not go like too tight unless I'm hedging my exposure with a lot of spot link. If I'm trying to capture the swing upwards, right? If I'm trying to do fees, I might set like really tight like this. If I am hedging exposure with some chain link spot bags, but if I want to stay in range for longer, I could do that spot bag strategy as well, but maybe keep a little bit of a buffer between the ranges here, right? So the range might be around like 0.002 and 0.01 for more safety. So I can see that based on the price performance, I would have been in range for like a few years here with this type of range, except in scenarios where there's a ton of volatility, like the altcoin season comes, maybe Chainlink would outperform Ethereum by quite a lot, right? So that's why we want to set wider ranges depending on what we expect in the market. And what we can do is backtest this range. So let's say it's 0.0100 and then 0.002 on the bottom range. And then I can run backtester and see roughly the APR that I'm able to generate. Because what's going to happen is that over the last 30 days or so, the price movement is not just going to stay at this peak concentration, right? It's going to bounce around a little bit. Now, when that happens, the wider range LPs typically would earn more fees than, if the range is just staying there in the middle. But one nice thing also is that even if the price is not very volatile, it would actually have very low impermanent loss, right? Which makes your LP, even with a wider range, outperform holding in the market. But we're planning for volatility because, in my opinion, you can't really tell how volatile an asset is going to be based on historical price alone. So it's better to go wider rather than tighter. Let's see here. So sometimes the fee APR is not very accurate. What I want to do in this case is take the 0.0167 in total fees, right? Multiply that by 12 because it's the last 30 days. What you're going to see is I put in 1 Ethereum and then I get roughly 0.2 Ethereum if I analyze the fees, right? So 20% APR with a relatively wide range here. And you might hear 20% and either feel that that's really good or that's really low, depending on what strategies you've been running. But Chainlink, you could consider this like a safer, larger cap, I would say. The larger the market cap, typically the safer an asset is, right? That's why they became a larger cap in the first place. But I personally have not looked that deep into Chainlink, and I don't hold a lot of Chainlink, so I can't say for sure. But you should be running through like these simulations with every tool that you deploy, right? And in terms of volume consistency, you guys can also do stuff like if we copy the pool address, paste it on sites like Gecko Terminal, then it's going to pull this exact LP, right? So I could click on that. And then here, if I have like a moving average on the volume, you're going to be able to see roughly, okay, what's the average volume. But again, this does not work as well for like pools with less liquidity, simply because sometimes people add and remove liquidity from these pools, and it's going to affect the volume data. But Revert, again, the volume seems pretty consistent, and that APR estimate is probably fairly accurate. And we could do the same with like other pools as well, but it's going to be like the same process. And if you guys have questions, again, you could leave it in the chat or just speak up. And the next thing I want to show is the Crystal app. The nice thing about Crystal and Revert is that there's a ton of data and it's completely free, right? And what I want to do in this case is I could filter for a specific token that I want to look for. For example, there is link on USDC as well, because they do suggest some blue chip pools. I could click the see all page and then see a bunch of blue chip pools. And your definition of blue chip might be different for everyone, right? For example, Sonic and ETH, would I call it a blue chip? I personally probably wouldn't, but everyone is different, right? But the idea here is we could look for a bunch of different pools, and then you can see this blue chip filter here. And Styles is asking, find us a good ETH and USDC pool. And that's exactly what I want to do here. So one thing that you could do is you could type in ETH or wrap ETH here in the search bar, and then dash USDC, right? Or slash, yeah. But here you're going to see a bunch of different pools, and then you can filter by total value locked as well. And again, I don't really think the metrics like the 24-hour volume is that helpful, or the 24-hour fees and stuff like that, or the price volatility. So you could turn off some of these columns here, price volatility, volume to TVL, and then the drawdown. I could hit apply. And then again, the most important metric is the fees to total value locked. And then you want to dive in deeper as well to see if the liquidity is too concentrated, right? Again, as I've explained earlier, the more concentration, the more this metric becomes like less accurate, simply because like it's going to pull a lot of fees, but a lot of those fees are going to go to the tight range LPs. And the aerodrome, I think the error pools calculation are not that accurate as well, but we could take a look. So let's just pull one aerodrome LP here, and then one LP on Polygon. And sometimes there's really low like total value lock pools, like this one on Optimism. So that's not very accurate. We could skip over that. Or you guys can, for example, add advanced filter, go to this total value lock. And then let's just say you want to stick with pools with at least $50,000 into it to infinity here, apply. So what I want to see is on the aerodrome pool, it doesn't show me like the concentration too clearly here. So at first glance, it looks really good, but we actually don't really know until we put into the pool or we go to aerodrome directly for this case, because most of the simulation I found with the aerodrome pools are not that accurate, especially if people are like withdrawing or playing with the liquidity all the time, right? And again, what you guys can also do is copy this pool address, paste it into Gecko terminal, and look at this pool from here. So what we're going to see is the volume seems relatively constant. There isn't like a huge crazy spike or withdrawal, simply because the pool is so big at like $39 to $40 million in like arrow here. But I could go directly into Aerodrome and kind of see the liquidity concentration, see if it's actually accurate for this pool. Let me connect really quickly. So I want to go to wrap ETH to USDC, and then let me double check here. 0.0446 feet here. It seems like it's this pool, 0.0437. And yeah, what you're going to see here, if you actually go into it, pool address here. So let me see if it's the same. Yeah, it's the same as the one that we pulled up here. Someone just added like $2 million worth of liquidity when we were just looking at it, right? So sometimes the liquidity number change a lot, but you can see there's like a huge block of liquidity here. So the APR estimate that you get on Crystal would actually not be that accurate, right? And again, I could compare the full range APR. You could see the APR actually dropped to like 0.05% APR, which is quite low, right? And typically, I don't really like to provide liquidity on Aerodrome simply because a ton of people would just squeeze the range here. That's kind of like the meta here, right? And as a wider range liquidity provider, you don't want too many of these like range squeezers because they're going to take a lot of the APR away. And a lot of these range chasers are just going to be shredded by impermanent loss. They're not actually going to turn a profit at the end of the day. So it's just a bad deal for everyone, right? But yeah. And the reason why is there is like a automated liquidity management tool here as well that you could deposit into the vault. And again, because of the auto rebalancing and the impermanent loss, I typically don't like these vaults at all. And you guys can check the performance of the beefy pools as well. There's like a bunch of different automated strategies, typically for like very volatile pairs. These strategies just don't work well. Doesn't it balance itself out when there is volatility? Yeah, that could be true, but we never know because what happens is like for these automated pools, sometimes like they rebalance pretty quickly when people get knocked out of range. So like your APR would still be lower than like a typical Uniswap pool on mainnet, for example, right? If that makes sense. Like they get knocked out of range maybe for a few minutes, you get like a higher APR and then they, auto rebalance and then your APR drops once again. So I personally don't like to farm pools that have too many of these like automated LPs going. I would have to actually look into the Mellow Vault to look at it. Grizzly is running a similar pool. How wide is your range though for the 20% APR? Just wondering.
My range is from 2,100 to 5,000. 5,500.
Yeah, we can compare that. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'm getting about 21% APR, and the pool is slightly different. It's the 0.044% fee.
Yeah, I think that might be like a bug or something because I don't see like a pool for 0.044%. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, but you said 2,100 to 5,000.
5,500, yeah.
So we can cross-check that fairly easily with either Revert or Crystal. But Revert, I don't think they support the Uniswap v4 yet. But let's take a look at like the Polygon pool I pulled up on Uniswap v4. So same deal, I could always copy the pool address while the data loads, go to Gecko terminal, pull up the pool, and then sometimes the data is wrong. You can see there's like negative liquidity, which is not possible. Same USDC. The volume is fairly constant in this pool. And what I can do is go back here and then it doesn't matter if the price feed doesn't load. The APR you can see sometimes it's not constant at all because of here, sometimes the total value lock jumps by a lot and then people withdraw liquidity. So this type of pool is probably not a pool that you want to be yield farming on. But just as an estimate, you could, for example, put in the range of 2,100 and then the estimate is 55% APR, right? And it's not going to be this high, I don't think, because the APR and the volume has just spiked recently for this pool, right? So let's take a look here. And there's pools on base as well. And maybe this is going to be more constant than the Polygon pool. We can look at the APR. Yeah, you can see that the APR is around like 25 to 50% for this pool. The total value lock is climbing, but also the volume has been kind of climbing as well, right? So this pool, the APR might be a bit more accurate. If we zoom out to the concentration, it's decent, but maybe not the best one, 2,100 to 5,500. And this is a rough APR that you would be getting roughly 16, 17%, assuming that the concentration stays here, right? But of course, the price action is going to be more volatile. So maybe you would get a very similar to what Grizzly would be getting on Aerodrome, like 20%, 25% for the space pool. But a lot of times, if you want to avoid those rebalancing pools, what we could also look at is only ETH mainnet pools. And then, for example, this ETH to USDC pool, I believe I was yield farming this pool, or I have some client positions here as well. So if we go here, we look at the APR, it kind of is like fluctuating, but not too bad. The total value lock is kind of declining a little bit, but the volume kind of just move up and down. So it's not too bad. It seems fairly consistent, and there's not a lot of like people withdrawing and adding liquidity that is affecting the APR data, right? So we could do like 2100 and then 5500 to look at the APR. So right now it shows like a 2% APR, and this is probably not accurate at all. And you can see sometimes the data on Crystal gets affected by this block of liquidity. So this is where like other tools like Revert Finance comes in. I could copy the pool address, and then let's say I go to a random ETH mainnet pool. If I click like ETH pool stats, what I'm able to do is I could paste the pool address to the URL, and that's how you could pull the pool data fairly quickly here. So what I want to do now is to change the price to be in, and then change the page, maybe look at something more recent. So the full range LP is pulling 4% and then some of these pools that are pulling 20%, I could click into it and look at the APR. So it depends on how you're measuring APR as well. If you're measuring on your cost basis, for example, for this guy, because he deposited when Ethereum's price is cheaper, you can see at this $2,500, they deposited at a cheaper price. And this is typically how I would do it if I want to ride the uptrend upwards and earn a yield in the process. Is like when the price is cheaper, I'm swapping from USDC, I put it into this pool, right? And then you can see it's roughly 34% APR on their cost basis, but on their HODL back is roughly 21%, right? And the range is fairly similar to Grizzlies. So the APR is kind of like pretty much normalized because a lot of yield farmers in the past have just been like optimizing for the APR for this pool and then for that pool. And then over time, what you're going to get is that the APR for most of these pools are going to be fairly close, right? People are going to move from like the low APR pools to the high APR pools. And then, it's going to normalize over time. So that 20% APR on Aerodrome is quite solid. And, it just comes down to then like which platform you prefer, right? But the idea again is to make sure you're comparing the APR before you deposit. What we want to avoid is like pools that have like low APR simply because the liquidity block is too tight and the volume is not enough to basically spike the APR as well. So Styles is asking, what's the difference between Uniswap V4 and V3? I believe for V4, there's something called like hooks. I'm not a dev, so I'm not sure. But what I would assume is that it makes the LP more programmable. I think there's different applications like Kyber Swap. If you guys have time, you might want to look into this as well. Let me find the link. Yeah, so this should be the official link here, kyberswap.com. So what they do is they utilize Uniswap V4, right? And then they have like a yield arbitrage strategy that is able to earn you more yield. So you can read like how it works in the blog on the link that I just sent. But basically from what I understand is like when there's like larger swaps and then you have to arbitrage the price difference, they do that for you and then give you the rewards from that whole process, right? And the Uniswap V4 pool allows you to do stuff like that. It could be, for example, yield farming the pools here to be able to do that. So I could filter by total value locked here or right here. So E to USDC. You can see on the V3, it's not going to allow that, right? But if I do farming pools, so Uniswap V4 fair flow pools here. So the total value lock is fairly low for now, but what it's going to give you is like additional yield from the yield arbitrage, right? From the price arbitrage. that they're doing. But yeah, it doesn't show you like the estimate APR right here, but maybe Crystal does. So you have to cross check that on Crystal. So it also shows on Crystal that it has like the Kuiper swap fair flow thing, right? But what I noticed right off the bat is that the volume is fairly low for this pool. So even with the fair flow, it's probably not worth it to be yield farming this pair, right? But that's the idea with the Uniswap V4. It's able to have like the hooks for the LPs. So it makes it easier for like automated LP pools or like protocols to program a strategy as well around the V4, I believe. Yeah. But yeah, that's basically how you use Crystal to find like good pools. You want to look at like the concentration, the liquidity amount, and like how constant the volume and the TVL is. And if you want a more constant APR, then you're going to be aiming for those pools that have more consistent data, right? Obviously, if the fees are really high and the concentration is less, then those are typically the best pools to aim for. Yeah. The next tool I want to share with you guys. So I haven't really shared this yet with most people, I think. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this on YouTube before, but what you could do is, for example, on CoinMarketCap, there's a new DEX scan function. What we are going to do in this case is actually look for higher cap altcoins to LP. So this is where the pool first approach comes in. Instead of like looking into each token and then like knowing what token to provide liquidity for already, and then going to look for APR there, what we could do in this case is to look for like the token first. So the reason why I pulled up this tool is because we could filter by fully diluted value. So if you notice with a lot of these pools, you're not actually able to filter for like fully diluted value or market cap, right? So a lot of the pools that you'll be pulling up if you're looking at fees alone are just a bunch of like meme coin pools or low cap pools that you might not be interested in as an investor. So what I want to do here is if you're trying to find like a mid cap or a small cap, then you could adjust the filter. But if you're finding like a blue chip LP that is above, like, for example, 1 billion, then you could put like 1 million K here, right? And then it's going to filter out all of the meme coins and then give you a list of like the harder assets as well as the larger cap assets. So this actually is a good page to kind of keep an eye on to see what's hot in the market. For example, Aster has been really hot recently. Avantis, Pump, Trump is still up here. But you know, what I also like to look at is this 24-hour volume and the liquidity comparison, right? So it's a really good sign if the 24-hour volume is greater than this liquidity. And this liquidity number also computes all of the available liquidity pools, right? So it's not looking at like one single pool. It's looking as a whole, okay, like how much volume is this whole token generating relative to the total available liquidity, right? For example, tokens like Blink have like a lot of volume, but at the same time has a lot of liquidity because it has been around for a long time, right? Then what we could expect is a lower yield compared to like tokens like Linea that is fairly new, but has a lot of volume relative to its liquidity. And it could change depending on how much on-chain volume we're seeing. And right now, for example, Aster is really hot. Then you're going to be able to have a lot higher yield farming these pairs, right? But of course, there's like downside with LPing hot pairs as well is like when these pairs are no longer trending or like have hype behind them, they tend to drift down in price. So that's something that you got to be really careful of as well. So yeah, there's a bunch of different stuff like PaxG. But for example, if I want to yield farm gold and I'm looking at the PaxG volume, even without diving into the specific pools, you can see PaxG has much more liquidity compared to the XAUT, right? XAUT is basically tokenized gold that is by Tether. It's at 11 something million liquidity, but the volume is at 4 something million. So about like 40% volume to liquidity compared to the past G1, right? Which is below 30%. Yeah, stats XP. Yeah, that's a risk with the newer and higher volume tokens. I was providing liquidity for stuff like bases for everyone. It was like hot for a while. The price action was pretty good. The yield was really good, but then, it just kind of died out. So just got to be really careful and keep some sizing in mind, right? But yeah, I think if I wanted to yield from like a higher volume pair that is already really hype, I would probably go in with like a hedge in the future as well. But yeah, there's like a list of really solid opportunities that you guys can dive deeper into. For example, Bach, I'm pretty sure this liquidity number sometimes is wrong, but it gives you like a rough estimate of like the hotter tokens and the pairs that you can look into. And for example, Ether, I believe, is an AI token, and it's able to actually summarize the project for you here as well. So this is really cool. And I actually haven't seen this before, and this is really nice. It just gives you like a summary of the project, right? For example, there's like the wormhole token as well, or like render. But yeah, this is a page that you guys can keep an eye on and basically dive deeper. And what I want to do here as well is if, let's say I find an opportunity that I like, I could click into it, like pump. What this is really nice for is it's able to pull a bunch of different pools here on the right? So what you're going to be able to see is a bunch of different opportunities. For example, on Meteora, Pump and USDC has been doing quite nice. The volume is quite high compared to its liquidity. And then again, if you want to cross-check data, you could always copy the pool address, paste it onto Gecko terminal. And what's really nice is it pulls up the pool really, really quickly, right? So for example, on PumpSwap, it's probably not the best place to be providing liquidity, simply because the liquidity is quite high and the volume is not that good compared to the liquidity, right? But if I go to, for example, if you want to provide liquidity for Radium, I'm currently on Radium for pump to USDC, then this is a great pool to look into further, right? But again, the concept behind like the normalizing PR would still apply here. For example, this is about like 2 or 3x the volume to total value lock, right? The Meteora is also about like 3x. And then some of these pools would have higher volume, for example, pump to Sol, but it is a crypto to crypto pool. So you could expect a larger drawdown if you're investing like stable coins into these pools, if there's like a big dump happen in the market. But yeah, this is really nice. You could see a bunch of different pools on a bunch of different dexes, and it's going to allow you to find out a lot of these pools fairly quickly, right? And this is also really nice for other chains, like for example, Sui or other chains like Linea, that a lot of these other tools don't support yet, right? So you can see Linea, if I go to this liquidity pools, what I would be able to see is that there's like some pools on EtherX. I have not used EtherX before, but this is like what we could be looking into, right? For example, this volume is really high compared to its liquidity. I could copy this pool address, go into Gecko terminal, and then pull up this pool. And then if I take a look at the average volume, I want to switch that to the price to be in USD if I want to look at the USD volume. What you're going to see is that the volume has been quite high compared to its liquidity, right? And then what you would typically do in this scenario afterwards is to go directly to the DEX platform and look at the data there. Because a lot of the tools that support the different dexes, they're not going to support these like lower TVL dexes, right? And then what you could also see is like the trading fee for this specific pool. So that's the data you could calculate manually as well, just off the top. Here, what's the average, APR of the pool? So like, let's say average volume is around 7 million based on this moving average, right? You're going to multiply that by 0.0005 I believe that's correct, 0.05%. So $3,500 a day, multiply that by 365. It's like 1 million something dollars over. And then if we divide that by available liquidity to 42940, you're looking at 500 something percent pool APR, right? And of course, if you're running a safer, wider range LP, you could expect this to be cut in half at least. So maybe like 200% or 100% APR on this specific pair. And again, we don't want to be blinded by the APR, right? We want to make sure that we're actually bullish on this asset and you actually build like the bull and the bear case thesis behind that particular asset. So let me pull up Styles' question onto my screen here. So we can move into the Q&A. If you have any question, Grizzly, feel free to drop them as well. So the first one is hype to UST0 is a good range to stay in for the next 6 months, seeing fees, APR, and price appreciation. So $30 to $100. Hype is a fairly large cap, so it would definitely take a lot of effort for it to pump, but it is in kind of like a price discovery mode. So it's very hard to say like, okay, what's the top of the range that you should be setting? But based on the historical price, you can see all of 2025. If you measure from like the launch close to the most recent high close, we did see a gain of about like 87%, 100% gain. So the top of the range being at $100 over the next 6 to 12 months is completely reasonable, in my opinion. It's a pretty realistic range. And again, when you're providing liquidity, you want to think about the worst and the best case scenario, right? And if you're fine with the price exiting the top or the bottom of the range, then that's a solid strategy that you could go for. But again, for like crypto to stable pool, you're not going to have the maximum price appreciation anyway, unless you're setting like a max upper range, right? Or like a really high upper range. For example, I was providing liquidity for ETH to USDC from like 2,000 to 100K. And a lot of people think that like that's the range is too wide, right? But I was still earning about like 10% APR on that pool while I'm waiting for ETH price to basically appreciate and dollar cost averaging out of my position. So that's another strategy that you could also consider as well. So the second is suggested range for ETH to USDC, balancing fees, APR, and price appreciation. 2,800 to 7,000. So off the top of my head, that is a pretty realistic range that is likely to stay in. So if we look at the monthly chart, you do see that on bigger drawdowns, sometimes ETH does crack down to test this like 50-month simple moving average. And like in really bad cases, it does crack below and close below, but it also seems to be able to reclaim this over time, right? So as long as it drops below and you're sitting tight or not doing crazy stuff like rebalancing down to chase the range, then that's a good bottom range to set, like 2,800 or 26, 2,500. And then 7,000 for Ethereum is also pretty realistic target. My target for Ethereum to peak out in the next 6 to 12 months is around like 7 to 10K. So yeah, it depends if you're trying to optimize for fees or not. But 2,800 to 7,000 is fine for if you want more fees. Yeah. But yeah, I personally don't like to go too tight. Stuff like, for example, like just a $1,000 price range. I think it's very hard to stay in range. But if it's like a couple $1,000s wide, it's typically fine for it there. You want to move a LP position to another wallet. No, you will not have a new entry. So it depends if you're sending the NFTs directly. If you've never interacted with NFTs before, I would recommend just withdrawing and then adding liquidity into that new wallet. But if you're using tracking software like Metrics Finance, then it would log it as a new entry, but your entry is going to be exactly the same as before, your actual entry, assuming like you're not making any swaps, right? You're withdrawing the liquidity and then depositing directly on the other wallet, and the price is relatively the same as before. And as long as you're doing it after you move it, then it should not have that much of a difference. Yeah, unless like you're withdrawing and then like you wait 6 months and then the price is completely different, then you could be looking at like a different asset distribution, right? And then frequently say compound one. Yeah, it's a general guideline, and that is especially true for like the lower caps or like the higher risk altcoins, simply because like, for example, if I'm providing liquidity for MOG and ETH, if I want more MOG exposure, the best time to compound is when it's below my entry. And then if it's above my entry, I typically want to look for like de-risking more if I already am heavily exposed to MOG. Simply because, you never know when the market is going to take a turn and these altcoins are going to drop by quite a lot, right? And one of the mistakes I made in 2024 is just compounding too much of my fees. And then when the market dries down, I'm giving back a lot of the gains back into the market. But yeah, if you want to build your SOL to ETH exposure, you could just keep compounding regardless of price as well, right? Just know that when you compound, if you value everything in ETH, just like how Bitcoin maxis would like value everything in BTC, right? If you're valuing everything in ETH, you're using it as like the quote asset or as a currency, a benchmark, then compounding above your entry would kind of like drag up your entry just by slightly, but it's going to allow you to earn that compound interest, right? Compounded capital, obviously earning like 50% APR on like 100K is going to be less yields than like earning it on like 120K, 130K, right? As you compound into the pool. So what do I do with the BTC in DeFi wallet? So if I'm running a leverage setup and I'm holding stuff like Wrapped Bitcoin or Coinbase Bitcoin, then I could be using that as like extra collateral, right? And I typically don't use Bitcoin that much to yield farm in like, either ETH to Bitcoin or Bitcoin to USDC, simply because I want more rewards. I did have client portfolio that, yield farmed Ethereum and Bitcoin, right? But that's like if you have like a larger portfolio or you want to take less risk, then you could be yield farming those pairs. But those pairs, since they're less risk, they typically have a lot of liquidity providers and will come with less yields as well. But it typically is good to have some like raw Bitcoin in your Bitcoin address rather than on the EVM chains as well, just to kind of like diversify your holdings in case these custodians do run into some issue. Like even with the Coinbase or Wrapped Bitcoin, you want to typically not hold only Wrapped Bitcoin and hold some like Coinbase Bitcoin as well to kind of diversify the custody, right? When launched at Drippy Finance website, I do have a preview. Let me just link it real quick, but let me see, because I might put this on YouTube. But it should be relatively soon. Meeting with Cornelius, which is like we're co-founders. So I usually just use Uniswap V3 simply because there's more tools available. And then I don't find the yield of the V4 to be that different from V3. And then with like new smart contracts, there's always more risk. And since I do put a pretty large amount of my portfolio into the LPs, I do buy insurance through like Nexus Mutual for Uniswap V3 LPs. If you go onto the site, the reason why I use V3, a big part of it is because the insurance is also cheaper. It's like less than 1% last I checked. It's like 0.5% or 0.5% per year of the insured capital for the Uniswap V3. And V4, last I checked, was like around 2 to 3% or 3 or 4% mainnet or other LTs. I can show you my portfolio right now. So mainly on mainnet, as you can see, but mostly stuff with like Pixel and then Project X on Hyper EVM on Base. And it depends on what you're trying to prioritize. Like if you have a smaller capital, smaller portfolio, then, I would be using Base or Arbitrum, right? Most likely Base, simply because I feel like Base is going to be able to attract more volume. Even if I'm using Uniswap, higher average volume typically also benefit Uniswap as well, because there's a lot of like arbitrage bots that would be like, swapping or like the DEX aggregator that is running the volume through like a bunch of different tools, right? But I also am providing liquidity for pump to USDC on Radium. Yeah. I think the best practice is to just not go too heavily into like newer chains or like the smaller LTs and stuff simply because, like the smaller chains and the newer chains are higher risk, right? I think that's pretty much it. I did not cover metrics finance, but I could go over that really quickly. And, if you guys have any other questions, I do have a few more minutes before I have to hop off. But yeah, so metrics finance pro is also a really great tool. And again, the tool you use would depend on what you're trying to look for, right? For example, I don't think they support Uniswap V4 yet for metrics finance pro. So if I'm looking for a V4 pool, I would be using Crystal in this case, right? But you can see it actually supports like a bunch of different platforms, a bunch of different networks as well. And what I really like is this fees to TVL tab. Again, this normalizes the different fee tiers, right? It does not really make sense to use like volume to TBL. What I can do is I was actually looking at like some Aave pools because I was discussing that with Styles, right? But basically you could type like, let's say you want to find like ETH to USD, and what is also going to include is a bunch of different stablecoin assets like USDT, or if there's like other stablecoins like, for example, OUSDT. I'm not sure if that's like USDT on Optimism, but you're able to filter for that. It is $50 a month for like the lowest subscription plan for Metrics Finance. And again, it's not like a must have. So if I want to filter for like 100K or the total value lock, I can do that. And then you can see these Aerodrome pools as well, right? I'm not sure like how accurate the Aerodrome APR is, but for these other types of LPs, this tool is fairly accurate. Yeah. And then what I could do is I can click simulate. So the 1% fee tier pool might have less consistent APR, and sometimes the APR would be higher, especially in like more volatile conditions. What we're going to be able to see is, for example, if I use Grizzly's range at 2100 to 5500, it would be earning roughly a 32% APR, assuming that the liquidity stays constant, within this period of time, right? But again, I want to be cross-checking with like the Gecko terminal. If I pull this pool, I want to see like the data, if it's correct, the total value lock and stuff like that. You can see for maybe back here, it's either just higher volume or there was more liquidity in the pool. So I could be cross-checking this in Revert as well. So if I go to just top position, click on a random base Uniswap pool, and then I can paste the address. What I can see is the total value lock history. So I think the base data for Revert is still broken, but maybe on Crystal, we would have more luck. So all network land here. The total value lock has been fairly constant in the last few days, but you can see it actually dropped by half earlier the last month, right? So this APR would definitely not be 31% because if you see like it's taking in this other data from the earlier in the month, right? So the APR would probably be half of that. So 15% APR. So with every tool, there's like a drawback. That's why, unfortunately, we still need to use a lot of different tools on Hyper EVM. So I think there's two main dexes on Hyper EVM. And then if you guys want to look for like different protocols, the best site to look for is DeFi Llama. If I go to DeFi Llama and Hyper EVM, what you're going to see is like the dexes. The two main ones right now is the Project X and the HyperSwap DEX, right? So it depends on which project you're more bullish on and what you think is going to give you more like airdrops or the current yield, right? But the TVL is fairly constant. It's not like, it's nothing crazy. But I think a lot of people switch from like HyperSwap to Project X to yield farm. But you could there's a bunch of different tools you could find pools on. Yeah. So you could do like, for example, with using Crystal, it pulls both HyperSwap and Project X, and I believe, so they got this as well on Metrics Pro, but here you're able to filter for only Hyperliquid. And then if I reset the filter, you're going to be able to see a bunch of different pools, right? And just like any DEX, if you go to the Project X website, you're going to be able to deposit the LP, right? Like liquidity. For example, I want to do hype to USDT 0. I could connect my wallet here. And again, what's really nice about Ravi Wallet is it does show you like, okay, this website is listed on like DeFi Llama and stuff like that, and the site popularity. So it is quite safe. Sign, confirm. And you should be cross-checking like the link with like their socials as well, right? But basically, if I zoom out here, I could, for example, set the range that Styles gave of like 30 to 100 or oops, 1,000. But yeah, like even a really wide range, you can see the estimated APR is still like a decent 13%, right? And the idea behind like a wider range as well is like, if you get in at a good entry and the price trend up from your entry onward, you would basically not lose in the US dollar value terms, right? So if you were LPing hype since like $10 and you're just like sitting in the pool, then it becomes like a fairly safe source of income. And of course, you still want to be bullish hype, right? But with the $100 max range, right now the estimate is 30% based on I think they use the 24-hour volume. I believe Crystal does as well. For example, you could go here 30 to 100 to 36%, right? And of course, your APR is going to be higher if the price like moves up really aggressively for a short while. But this is like roughly what you could expect. And again, you want to be looking at the total value lock. It does seem pretty constant. The fee and the volume seems fairly constant as well. Like the APR estimate would not be accurate if you're seeing like a peak in volume. And because like these platforms do use the 24-hour estimate, you're not going to have a very accurate estimate, right? But what you could do is, for example, during the peak volume, you can see it's about like 2.5x of the normal volume. What you can do is just take this APR estimate and discount it, right? If it's around 2x, and 36% APR. That's how you could get like a fairly accurate estimate. But I personally would not like over obsess on like getting a super accurate APR. What we need is like more than a rough estimate. That's also why I say like, metrics finance is a nice tool, but it's not completely necessary either, simply because you don't actually need like a too accurate of a APR estimate. Yeah. But yeah. Any last questions before I hop off? I got another meeting after this. All right. Thank you guys for coming. I'll most likely put this on YouTube. We'll see. But it'll definitely be there for like the early supporters of the course. Yeah. Thank you guys. I'll catch you guys on the next workshop.
Sweet, bro. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man. Hope that was helpful.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys. See you guys.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.